Well, good evening, good morning even to all of you out there. My name is Sandy Campbell. I'm the Executive Director of the Santa Fe Council on International Relations. We're delighted you've joined us for yet another live stream. We're now in our third week of conference, and we've covered some pretty fascinating ground so far. Earlier today, of course, we heard from Dr. David Scrace, who's the Secretary for New Mexico Human Services here, and who is essentially the head of New Mexico's response to coronavirus. And we heard about how the Los Alamos National Lab has participated in this and how scientists have really interacted with journalists to help us, the consuming public, really understand the news we need to understand in order to take the actions we need to take during this time of pandemic. For those of you who have missed it, it's up on our YouTube channel. You can also find it on our website, journalismunderfire.org/gallery. Lots of good stuff on there, lots of other talks on there. Please check it on out and catch up on what you missed. And of course, we have lots of stuff coming up. So tomorrow, we're going to continue our conversation of coronavirus when we look at covering crisis in Indian country. And we'll be featuring 3 young journalists who've been looking at what's been going on in Navajo Nation and then also in tribal communities in New Mexico. That's at 1 o'clock Mountain Time tomorrow. And then tomorrow morning, we're going to go to Africa and we're going to visit Nigeria and Kenya and Botswana and get an update there on how coronavirus has really shaped the craft, the art, the science of journalism across the continent. That's also going to feature the International Visitor Leadership Program, of which many of you know we're a proud partner of the US State Department and have been for 56 years now. So there's a lot to come out and learn about and engage with these speakers on. Then we're going to take a little break for Thanksgiving because, boy, I could sure use one, and I'm sure everyone else could too. And in the following week, starting on November 30th, the first streams are on December 1st. 2nd, and then 3rd, our closing ceremony features Bob Woodward in conversation with Dana Priest. And we will also have Peter Baker, the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, and his wife, Susan Glasser, who's a staff writer at the New Yorker, and Joel Simon, who's the executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. We're gonna have some music. We'll all raise a drink to celebrate successful 4 weeks of conference, so be sure to join us. Let me just reiterate one more time. The panel for Africa tomorrow is at 10 Mountain Time. There was a slight typo in the conference booklet stating it started later in the day, but it starts at 10 a.m. So with all of that said, I'd love to move right into tonight's panel, and I'm going to welcome our 2 panelists. Well, not panelists, they're 2 individual presenters. We're going to hear from Lauren Walsh first, but first I'm going to introduce Laura Paskus. Hi, Laura, how are you?
Hi, Sandy. I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Let me introduce you really quickly, and then I've got a question for you. So Laura has been writing about New Mexico's natural resources and communities since 2002 as an assistant editor of High Country News, a radio producer at KUNM-FM, managing editor of Tribal College Journal, and as a freelance for a variety of publications from the Santa Fe Reporter, New Mexico In-Depth, and Indian Country Today. Laura, I know you finished a new book. I know we might be talking about that later, but how is launching a book during time of coronavirus going?
It's definitely been interesting timing. Sad to not connect with readers in person, but it's the topic, sadly, I guess, is really timely this summer. We definitely saw a lot of impacts of climate change all across the country and the world. So timely, but you know, maybe not the greatest topic to read about in a pandemic.
Right. Why look at another crisis when we're in the midst of dealing with this one? And yet, the environmental crisis, I think we all know, is the mother of all the crises that we're in right now. So, Laura, thanks for joining us. We're going to come to you at 6:30 Mountain. We're really looking forward to what you have to share with us tonight. And let me now welcome Lauren Walsh. Hi, Lauren. How are you?
Hey, Sandy. I'm okay.
Good. Welcome. So Lauren is director of the Gallatin Photojournalism Lab at New York University, as well as director of Lost Rolls America, a National Archive of Photography and Memory. I like that. She's interested in the politics and ethics of photography, focusing particularly on photojournalism with a specialty in conflict photography. Lauren, you're in New York City right now. How's how's your pandemic going in New York? How are things?
Things were terrible in the spring and got marched toward better and better. Our numbers are still not too bad here, but the case numbers are going up again. So I think one of the things, I guess, that New York is doing pretty well is most people are wearing masks. So thankful for that.
Yes, we have that here in New Mexico too, thankfully. Well, I know you have a great presentation lined up for us, so I'll toggle off in a second. Folks, we will get to you Q&A in about 40, 45 minutes time. So please ask your questions in the Q&A box and we'll get to them when the time comes. And Lauren, over to you.
Great, thanks. I'm gonna share my screen. Here we go. So the topic, of course, photographing social crisis today. Before I start in with any images, I will be talking about images of crisis, images of conflict. So I like to start with a statement to put everyone in the right mindset for seeing these kinds of images. I don't have images of guts and gore coming up, but I nevertheless think that some of the photos that I will be showing are upsetting or distressing in context. So this is just to put everyone in the right frame of mind. I thought by way of organizing my thoughts, I would start with a story. And it's the story about why I wrote my most recent book. Here we go, is the cover of the book. It's it's called Conversations on Conflict Photography, and it allows me to present to you some ideas that we can use for thinking about photographing social crisis today. So the story behind this goes back a few years to one of my classes at NYU. It was a course on conflict photography and ethics. And at a particular point in the semester, we were studying the coverage of a severe famine in Sudan in the early 1990s. So when I say that we're studying ethics and conflict photography, I mean, we're asking questions like, what does it mean to take pictures of someone else's crisis or suffering? And what does it mean to look at those pictures of someone else's crisis or suffering? And what do we do with the knowledge that these visuals bring to us? So we're studying this famine in Sudan. It's in the early 1990s. And the way that I teach is very interdisciplinary in nature. And so I assign to my students texts that give them the history of what was happening in Sudan. And they have to read about the political forces that were shaping this famine. Of course, it's a course on photography, so they're looking at the documentary and photojournalistic coverage of the famine, and they're reading critiques of that. So I'm trying to give them a rounded picture, even if the medium that we're studying is the photographic medium. I want them to understand it in a kind of full and rich capacity. So we come into class, and as I'll do tonight with screening lots of images, what I do in my classrooms is that I screen images and we talk about the image and we react to it and we put it in context. And so I had just loaded up the first image in my class, and I'll give you the verbal description. I will also show the image. It does fall under that heading that I was saying before, as it is, I think, an upsetting image. It's a black and white photograph. It's taken at a feeding center in Sudan. And it shows a man who is extremely emaciated. And you glean from the image that this man is incredibly weak. He's not walking, he's not even standing, he's crawling on the ground. So it's an image, I think, that confronts you with how dire situations of human suffering can be. So I put up the image in my class, and here is the photo. Oops. And just as I was about to start talking, one of my students raised his hand and said, "Professor, I understand why you're showing us that. I know it came from the homework, but it's such a downer, and I have plans tonight. And I don't feel like I should be put in a bad mood by having to look at that image. I have nothing to do with that man's suffering, so why should I care? I'm gonna move us to a slideshow of images that are published in my book by way of continuing my anecdote. So the student had just said, why should I care? And for me, this was a completely arresting, stunning moment as a teacher. I had never before heard a student say something like that. And I should explain, it's not a required course. It's an elective, so every student knows that we will be discussing these challenging issues, and we will be looking at difficult photographs. And so to hear this student say, don't ruin my plans tonight. Why should I care about that man? Why should I care about someone suffering, particularly suffering that's far away? It just sounded to me like such self-serving apathy. And I made my way through the seminar session that day, but it was just such a defining, stunning moment. I couldn't let it go, and I kept thinking about it and thinking about it and thinking about it. And by coincidence, that same day, as I was on my way home from work, I ran into a friend of mine who's a photographer who's covered conflict around the world. And I told him what happened in my classroom. And I really thought he was going to say something along the lines of, "That's so offensive. How dare your students say that?" Or something like that. But he didn't. What he said instead was, "Why are you so surprised? There's nothing provocative about what your student said. Do you have any idea how often I hear reactions like that?" And at that moment, something clicked. And I thought, well, if that dismissiveness, that level of disinterest in someone else's suffering, that kind of apathy, if that's rather common, then what's the point? What's the point of taking these pictures? What's the point of distributing these pictures? And at a very kind of basic level, what's the point of conflict photography? So I set out to do a book that would answer that particular question. And then along the way, I wound up covering a lot of ground. And I'm going to lay out a bunch of themes because they pertain to where I'll take this talk tonight. So some of the topics covered in the book are, what are the physical risks that conflict photojournalists face? What are the emotional or psychological tolls that this kind of work takes on the journalist? What about forces that act as censors? How have the recent digital and technological shifts radically reshaped the industry landscape? Does the audience receive their images differently? Do they understand what these shifts mean? And then, what's the value of a single image today in an age of image saturation? So those are some of the topics I covered, and I decided to do the book not from the perspective of the professor who kind of lectures at her audience. Here's my argument, here's why it's correct, and this is what you should believe because I decided to take a different style. I wanted to get behind the camera lens and inside the newsroom. And I decided the best way to do that would be to give voice to the people who are making and disseminating these kinds of images. So I structured the book as a series of interviews, and I broke it into 3 parts. I interviewed photographers who cover conflict around the world. I interviewed photo editors who, of course, play an enormous role in controlling the flow of visual information, right? We will publish these images, we will hold those images back. And I also interviewed key figures at humanitarian organizations, because those organizations, especially as budgets inside the newsrooms are shrinking these days, those organizations are stepping in as funders of this kind of imagery. But an aid organization is not a journalistic entity. And so I wanted to think about, what does it mean for an aid organization to create imagery that looks very similar to journalism? How are they using it? Does the public understand the difference between a photograph that is advocacy for instance, Doctors Without Borders versus a photograph that appears in the New York Times? I had a few goals with this book. I'm going to lay them out and then I'm going to show you examples. this is an industry that tips more Western than not and more male than not. And so it was very important to me to push past those limits when I did these interviews. So I have interviews with men and women, with Western and non-Western practitioners. I have interviews with world-renowned photojournalists who have decades of experience, and I have voices that represent a rising generation. I have staff, I have freelance. I really wanted a breadth of perspectives because the vast genre of conflict imagery is quite pervasive, and it's coming at us from many different places. And I thought the more I could represent all these aspects of diversity, the better the book would be. I should also say that I didn't call the book Conversations on War Photography, and I did that very consciously because to my mind, war photography summons forth particular visual tropes. So soldiers, weapons, tanks, and I do cover that kind of imagery in the interviews that I conduct, but I'm also interested in what is the documentation of conflict away from the front line? What are the civilian tolls? And what about natural disasters? And what about humanitarian crises and gender injustices and social and political upheaval? So I consider conflict very broadly. And as with that class that I was teaching, where this whole thing started, the course on photography and ethics, I am deeply interested in the ethical complexities of this kind of imagery. And I think anytime that you're talking about the visual documentation of someone's suffering or someone's oppression or someone's injustice, the stakes are very high, and the ethical complications are also, there are a lot of them. And so I put a lot of these difficult questions to the photographers and the editors that I interviewed. I think just in a very kind of basic way, it's kind of a straightforward thing to say, but we are bombarded by visuals all the time. And for me, the goal with the book and the goal with this talk tonight is to slow down and think more carefully about these kinds of images, in particular because the stakes are very high. And so I'm going to walk us through a few of the themes that I touched on that appear in the book. And I'm going to then turn our attention to very recent 2020 coverage of social crisis and photography. So this first photograph, I'll let the audience read the captions. It's not a stretch to understand that if you are a journalist who is covering traditional conflict, if you are covering wars and front lines or any spaces where that involves weapons and violence, you are potentially physically in danger yourself, right? You are close to violence. And so there are photographers in my book who speak about this. There's at least one who was injured, I believe 4 times, who was shot, who was hit by shrapnel, and he talks through his experiences of that. I chose this particular image because those kinds of situations don't just affect the photographer. This particular image, I'm going to select an excerpt from the interview with a photo editor. And what does it mean to be the photo editor and to learn that one of your journalists who is out in the field has been shot? So this excerpt is from an interview with Marianne Merton. She is the senior digital editor at Paris Match magazine. It's a French weekly magazine, and it's a magazine that very much prioritizes the role of photography in their coverage. And here she is on the ways that she protects journalists on the ground and in the newsroom. So here's what she says. As far as the specifics of the editor's role in a situation like this one that you're looking at, when one of your reporters or photographers is seriously injured, you have to reassure and act quickly. It's very important that your journalists in the field know that people in Paris, where the magazine is based, care about you and are working to help you out, literally out of the situation. As an editor, you place people very close to the story and therefore very close to the danger. Sometimes they risk their lives, but they know what they are doing and you have to trust them. And likewise, it's very important that my reporters and photographers trust me. They know I'm there for them to help them. And in the end, to do a good story, they have to go for it. You can't stay at the hotel, you're on the front line. This, of course, is what I respect in these journalists, but it's not reasonable. This isn't a reasonable job, and it's certainly not typical work. And then every week, all the editors meet to finalize the makeup of the upcoming issue, selecting stories that are already done and ready to be published. So as editor, you also have to protect your journalists' stories because other editors want magazine space too. 10 pages on some ridiculous feature story when you've had your people in the field for 10 days risking their lives. And the response you hear is, but we saw that on TV already, so we don't care. So you stand up for your journalists and their work. So it gives you a little glimpse into how she was thinking about fighting for her journalists. This is a photograph by Iman Hilal. She's an Egyptian photographer. And I selected two little pieces of my interview with her. One where she touches on her own personal experiences of the difficulties she has faced as a non-Western journalist trying to break out and get international exposure via major Western media entities. And then she also talks about having faced gender discrimination as a professional female photographer. First, she says, I know how it can be difficult to get exposure or to work with American media. My sense is American media prefers to work with American and European photographers, even here in Egypt or any place in the Middle East. And that was her personal experience. Then she also says, Egyptian editors trust men more and consider them more qualified than women to cover clashes. Most of our bosses are men and they believe that journalism is a man's job. So during the early days of the Egyptian Revolution, the editor-in-chief announced that women could take a vacation because he was afraid to take responsibility and to believe in women journalists. So the newspaper sent male photographers and I really fought against that. I worked beyond my shift just to show them that I can do this too. This next image is by Shahidul Alam. He's a Bangladeshi photographer. And I selected this one. It touches on, it's related to what Iman Hilal was just saying about kind of Western, non-Western imbalance. And here Alam talks about how Western media traditionally portrayed majority world countries as icons of poverty. And for those who aren't familiar with the term majority world, it is an updated term to refer to or to supplant the terminology of developing countries and third world countries. The logic being that both of those terms, developing and third world, have a hierarchy implicit in them. You're not first, you're not even second, you're third. There's a kind of ranking system. Whereas the term majority world reflects the reality that the majority of the world's population from those countries comprise the majority world. So here is what Alam says again about Western media and their traditional portrayals. I think too often media entities treat the public as an idiot and give very simplistic narratives, shying away from nuances. The attitude is, give us something that the people will get immediately. We can't deal with stories that are too complex. The poverty story is something that the media feels is an easier sell, which is why they do it. But then that's the only perception of the other that the American public gets. It's more expensive, more time consuming to do in-depth, sensitive stories about characters. So the simplification happens even more now because budgets are tighter. So in this particular case, this photograph that you're looking at, it was taken in Anwara, Bangladesh. This little girl had lost everything in the cyclone. Her entire family had died. Her home was gone. And there she was. Of course, I was very concerned about her. What happened afterwards for me is more relevant to the picture than the picture itself. Pretty soon after I took that photo, the girl found a home. There was another family just as destitute who took her on as their child. And that is really what the story is about. Horrendous things will happen to people. It's what happens afterwards that teaches you about a people and a place. To me, it's remarkable that the poorest people I've ever come across are also the most generous. And what is never mentioned, meaning in Western media, is that the biggest support structure by far in a country like Bangladesh are the families themselves. So here was this incredible story of generosity with this little girl, yet no one was interested in it. I have pictures of her joining her new family and finding food. Perhaps they were not dramatic enough. They certainly won't win many awards, but I think they're an important part of the story, which in this particular case didn't get told. One image ran in the New York Times, but not this entire story about a local support structure. Here's a photograph from Syria. It's taken by a Syrian photographer. His name is Hossam Katan. And for this one, a photo editor was talking to me about compassion fatigue and the news media's responsibility. So we all know there's an ongoing war in Syria, but to recontextualize it for all of us, it began in March 2011, so we're coming up towards a decade of fighting. Over 5 million people have left the country, over 6 million are internally displaced, and some estimates put the death toll at around 500,000. Here's what this photo editor said. With Syria, there's a battle against a public amnesia. People forget at some level what's going on there because you go on with your everyday life and one story bleeds into the next or surpasses the next, and then you've forgotten the horror there. You know it in the abstract, but not in a way that forces you to confront it or really grapple with it. And yet what's happening in Syria with civilians is just atrocious. And sometimes it's very important to focus regularly on a situation, even if it seems repetitive to do so. It's crucial that the media not abandon places in crisis. And this editor spoke in terms of Syria, but I think it's a statement that could be made of many crises that continue around the world. It's crucial that the media not abandon these places. This is a photograph by Alexander Joe. He is from Zimbabwe originally, now lives in Madagascar. And I selected this one because he, among many of the photographers and editors in my book, spoke to me about the emotional toll of covering and witnessing suffering and violence and death. This was, in fact, quite a strong thread through the interviews. Photographers spoke about having nightmares, flashbacks, intrusive thoughts. In the recent past, it has been much more recognized in the world of journalism, in the world of photojournalism, that PTSD is a reality for media correspondents who are doing this work. And some studies show that the journalists who are covering war and suffering, they are exhibiting rates of PTSD that are on a par with soldiers who are part of active combat. So here's what Alexander Joe says. This work takes a toll, so I had to find ways to balance. I would always switch it off when I got home. I never spoke to my family about it. My daughter used to get angry. She'd say, "What did you do?" "Oh, nothing." "What do you mean nothing?" "Just nothing." I didn't want to subject them to this, and maybe also I didn't want to relive all those experiences again. I learned this early. There had been a bomb blast in Harare, which was in then Rhodesia. I remember walking into the store where the blast occurred, a place akin to a Walmart. I could smell the TNT, and there was glass, blood, devastation everywhere. For the next 3 or 4 years, whenever someone struck a match, that smell of sulfur would induce flashbacks to that scene. So I realized, never talk shop with family or friends. Keep it separate. This doesn't mean I'm a stone. There were many times I cried. One time, covering one of my first bad famines in Ethiopia, I broke down. I have some upcoming excerpts from another photographer who's been covering COVID, and he also will touch on the emotional tolls of this. So I want to shift into focusing on very recent social crises. And each of these doesn't fall under the traditional heading of conflict, but these are the conflicts of our times right now. And the 3 bullet points I have here are COVID-19, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the US presidential election. I think that it's not a stretch to say that 2020 is a historic year. I mean, it's just different. In terms of COVID, we all remember other epidemics, the Ebola epidemic from not that long ago. But this is a once in a century global pandemic. There have been over 55 million cases worldwide, over 1.3 million deaths. In the United States, we have had 12 million cases and over 250,000 deaths. And I would argue that the same momentous quality or historic quality is there with the Black Lives Matter movement. According to the New York Times, 2020's Black Lives Matter protests constitute the largest movement in this country's history in terms of people amassing in public spaces to demonstrate with their voices and their bodies. So if we think about that, these are the largest mass civil rights protests in United States history. They've also led to very new questions for photojournalists on how to document, and I'll explore that further. And of course, the US presidential election has been historic. We saw a summer of Black Lives Matter protests transition to a fall of public demonstrations surrounding or regarding the election. And that also led to new terms for photojournalists, particularly with regard to risks and threats on the ground. As I said at the outset, I'm always deeply interested in thinking about the role of photography globally. Like, images come to us from all around the world. And so I've selected excerpts from an interview with a photographer who is based in Peru. His name is Rodrigo Agd. He works for the Associated Press. And I should explain that the majority of his images, particularly let's say his COVID coverage, are published outside of the country of Peru. So domestically, Peruvians are not necessarily seeing his images, and you'll hear a little bit about why. To give us some COVID context in terms of Peru, like everywhere, they are battling coronavirus, and the situation there has been critical. The numbers, of course, are lower than in the United States. They have about 1 million cases at this point, but their rate of infection and death has been tremendous. And I'm going to read a statistics from a Johns Hopkins report that came out in September. So it's 2 months old, but it gives you context. Peru's per capita COVID-19 mortality rate was higher than that of any other nation except the European Republic of San Marino. So with that as background, here is what Rodrigo says about the photograph that you're looking at. This is the main Peruvian cathedral. There is the Archbishop of the Diocese of Lima throwing incense, and he'll be giving a mass that will be broadcast on TV. The day before that mass, the workers of the church put up all these portraits that relatives sent in. They printed the images right there at the church. For me, this was an amazing story. The people, the relatives, want others to see what is happening. This was a signal from the people. Everyone knows that this mass will be broadcast to millions of Peruvians. The people who suffered were not being represented in local media or by the government, and this was a way for them to gain voice. Collectively, they shout, "Look, this is massive. This is not only my relative. Look how many people are here on the benches and walls of this church." They were showing the rest of the country that didn't have an understanding of what was going on. I don't know official numbers of deaths, but organizations said the death rate this year was almost double what the government was reporting. In Peru, we have a bad economic situation, and media organizations can depend on official state money. But if you report badly on the government, you're not going to receive that money. So some of the newspapers and TV programs were trying to be quiet about the reality of the situation. They were trying to do some stories on the crisis, but they weren't showing that the country was immersed in death. It's a terrible situation for the local news to be so dependent on the government. This is why it is not common to see an investigative story about our government. The news media have to be very cautious or they lose funding. So for all of the critiques we may have of journalism in the United States, we do have the privilege of a free press that is not run by the state. And here we hear from Rodrigo about the pitfalls and the dangers of when media is dependent on the government. He also spoke to me about this photograph. And here he says, "For this photo, the daughter of Ricardo Noriega spoke to us. She was waiting for us when we arrived. She said that he died on the sofa, the same sofa that he has had for years. The framing here is very important for showing that. At that moment, it was a new thing to grasp that people were dying in their houses because, as I said, nobody was telling that story. But there were no more beds in any hospitals. So you'd hear, 'You have the symptoms? I'm sorry, wait in your house to die. That was the story we wanted to tell. Rodrigo also talks about the tolls of covering crisis at home, and he is a seasoned photojournalist. He has covered conflict, he has covered violent situations like gang violence, and here he speaks about covering crisis right at home. You go to cover Afghanistan with a military battalion, you know that you're going to cover a specific story. Or you go to Libya and you know Gaddafi is the story. He is either going to leave the country or be killed, or there will be a military coup. The problem with this coverage is that there is no end, or at least no end that is coming soon. You never see the end, and psychologically that's complex and heavy. And the conflict is at home. You're covering dying, death, funerals, grief, all right at home. Sometimes with funerals, people celebrate the dead, they drink together. Other times at these funeral homes, everyone is crying, they're breaking down. You're trying to absorb all of it and trying to document carefully what you see. So you push your emotions aside, but you're taking all of those emotions in. So then you put those emotions in a bag and you carry that bag. Sometimes it's nice to carry that bag and you can deal with it. And sometimes it's really hard. It's very difficult to sleep, to get away from those emotions. And that is a sentiment that I've heard echoed through a number of photojournalists I've spoken to about covering COVID and what it means to cover a major crisis at home. By way of shifting topic towards looking at some Black Lives Matter coverage, I said before, these are the largest mass civil rights protest in United States history. And they've also raised very new questions that photojournalists are grappling with. So in the United States, if you are in a public space, you have the right to photograph. You do not need consent, you do not need permission. And historically, this was not an issue for journalists, but this year, along with these demonstrations, came requests for photojournalists to put down the camera or to get explicit consent or to blur faces. And I will talk us through the two images that are on screens. These requests stemmed in part from fears that police were using facial recognition technologies to identify protesters and potentially target them or seek retribution. And we have to remember, of course, that the protests began immediately after the murder of George Floyd. They began as a massive mobilization to say police brutality, excessive police force against Black civilians is not acceptable. And at many of these protests, there were explicit calls to defund the police. So you have protesters and police often, not always, but often in an antagonistic relationship, wary of each other. But these requests to blur or to put down the camera create a very complicated scenario for a photojournalist. So on the one hand, a responsible photojournalist doesn't want to endanger the subject of their photo. And on the other hand, the photojournalist's job is to be there, to witness, to document things as they are, not to censor imagery. I have a quote from a New York Times photo editor, Brent Lewis, and here's what he says about those requests to blur. These commenters don't seem to understand the ethics of journalism or the power of images, nor do they fully get the significance of these protests in the larger context that they play in the narrative of Black people rising up in this country. There is power to the photo and there is power in numbers. Why would someone go through preparing to protest in the midst of a global pandemic just to have their image blurred, hidden, whitewashed? If photographers blurred the faces of the marchers and protesters from the civil rights movement, would the needle have moved as much in the 1960s? And so here are two images by Nina Berman. It's actually just one photograph. On the left is the photo as she took it. And on the right, she's applied blur. Nina is an American photographer who has experience covering conflict, but she really focuses her attention these days on the social and political landscape of the United States. What she says about what you're looking at here is, as for blurring faces, well, you can look at this photo and see it as an exercise in visual absurdity. I'm not interested in photography that blurs away the outrage of a public uprising. This is a moment of mass action. If I had 30 people screaming at me, "Don't take my picture," then I would find another way to document this. And she found herself in a situation where she did have to find another way to document. So here is what she says of the photo I have on screen now. Prior to this 2020 conversation, there was a strong consensus that with protests and really any activities in public, there is no expectation of privacy, no expectation of asking permission of people to make their picture, as that is antithetical to what journalists are supposed to do, which is to witness and observe and document. Now this view is being called into question, and I myself am reflecting on it because of the use of facial recognition technology and because of the perception, valid or not, that it is the images taken by professional photojournalists that police are primarily using in cases where they arrest or harass or monitor protesters. So even though I have been in situations where protesters may scream at you to stop, while they're taking their own pictures and live streaming their presence, which seems completely hypocritical, I feel I have to meet people where they are and understand their headspace. This is a time for us photographers to reflect on our practice. For instance, I was covering a Black Lives Matter event at the mayor's home at Gracie Mansion. There were maybe 700 people there. Before the event kicked off, the protest leader told a few of us that pictures of people's faces were forbidden. The Associated Press and the New York Times photographers walked away and refused to even acknowledge the statement. I tried to talk with the person to understand why, and he flipped me off. But I took it as a kind of challenge. Could I cover this in another way? What would that photography look like? I ended up being a far less aggressive in-your-face photographer. I was more sensitive to the temperature of the crowd, and my photography became much quieter. My pictures in turn were more intentioned. It was a way to show the size of the crowd and the unity of purpose without showing faces. So that's Nina's take on this. I've spoken with other photographers who have told me things like, I'm certainly not there to offend anyone I'm taking a picture of, but I am here in my job to document. And if you're in a public space, I will take your picture. So the debate continues to some extent, and there's not a solid consensus. Prior to 2020, there had been a growing conversation in the photojournalism world about who has the right to take whose picture, who has the right to document someone else's suffering. Do you need to be, let's say if you're documenting an oppressed community, do you need to be from that community to take the picture or to tell the story most effectively? This, of course, has kind of slammed to the forefront this year, particularly with coverage of race in the United States. There are people who say that, yes, you must be from a particular community in order to document it. You must be an insider. There are people who say, no, if you're a sensitive, ethical, responsible photojournalist who does your research, then you will document just as powerfully and respectfully and strongly as an insider. It's a question that I posed to Marianne Golan, the director of photography at the Washington Post, and here's what she said. With the Black Lives Matter movement, we've seen a reawakening on race, a reckoning. It's a wake-up call to seeing other points of view. I think newsrooms are like all of corporate America. They're largely run by white males, so the newsrooms don't represent the breadth of society. You go no place but up by having more and more people covering communities where the people in those communities feel comfortable speaking with somebody who looks like them, who talks like them, who comes from their background. So the more diversity you have across the storytelling, the better the journalism would be, one would hope. And I picked this particular photograph because Marianne was very proud of a body of work that the Washington Post did. It's called George Floyd's America. It's a multi-part series, and it goes very in depth into systemic racism in the United States today. So I'm sure all of us, we've all seen pictures of protests, and by and large, those images exist in a breaking news cycle. It's news that, traditionally, it's news that occurs within the past 24 hours. So a protest in Manhattan, midday, there'll be photographs of it in an evening report. And breaking news serves a really important purpose of keeping the public very up to date, very quickly, in a very timely manner. By contrast, this piece, George Floyd's America, is part of long form journalism. And what this multi-part series did was covered the systemic racism that George Floyd faced, the systemic racism that hobbled his ambitions. They looked at the neighborhood where he was from, the people who survived him, the role of criminal justice. Marianne said, the whole entire project began from some work that Joshua Lott, the photographer whose image you see here, that it began from some work that Joshua Lott had done. And the idea she wanted to convey was, when you have varied journalists who are smart and sensitive and practiced and diverse in style and experience, then you get great work. And this is a multi-part series involving many different reporters and many different photojournalists. And just to give some stats on what she said about the imbalance in the newsrooms being gender imbalance and racial imbalance, I pulled this from the Pew Research Center, and I want to just highlight this because I think it's very important. More than 3/4 of newsroom employees are non-Hispanic whites. And granted, this is from a survey that's a few years ago, but it is not particularly out of date. And newsroom employees are more likely than workers overall, meaning workers in all other sectors in the US. Newsroom employees are more likely to be male. About 6 in 10 newsroom employees are men. And it comes back to that idea that Marianne said, that you go no place but up the more diversity you have in your newsrooms. The final image that I want to show tonight touches on election coverage. And I said that there were new risks or new threats that photojournalists have been facing. It's not new for me to say that President Trump has had a dangerously antagonistic relationship with the press, often referring to media correspondents as enemies of the people, most often when the journalism is inconvenient to him or critiques or criticizes him. But that phrase, enemies of the people, is a phrase that stands directly in opposition to the fundamental role of journalism in democracy. At its core, at its heart, at its beginnings, journalism is there to serve the governed and not to serve the governing. So to call media correspondents enemies of the people is to fundamentally misunderstand what journalism is. Nevertheless, Trump's rhetoric has helped to build a climate of danger and to embolden individuals to harass the press. And the threats against the press aren't just coming from one side of the political spectrum. So obviously, this month we witnessed an extremely high stakes election. We've long had a polarized electorate. We have a problem here with disinformation. And all of this is coming to a head at a moment of extreme racial, social, political tension right now. There are many media watchdog organizations that have been tracking threats against journalists and very concerned about this election-related violence. And just to give you one example, for the first time in its quarter-century history, the International Crisis Group, which is an independent, non-governmental organization whose mission is to call attention ahead of deadly conflicts in hotspots around the globe, for the first time in their history, they turned attention to the risks of violence in the United States with regard to the election. These two photographs are by Ron Haviv. He's an American photographer, more known as a war photojournalist, but recently has been covering the US political landscape. And he says, "There is a saying in business that when both sides are not happy when making a deal, it's a good deal. Today, when working as a journalist covering the political landscape, we have at least 3 sides that we are documenting, and none of them is happy with the role that journalists play. Pro-Trump, anti-Trump, and the police, they all, in their many forms on the ground, on the airwaves, and in print, exclaim their disinterest, distrust, and disappointment in the ways they are visually shown, whether in mainstream media or on social media. This can often play out in a dangerous and confrontational manner on the ground in real life, or in the digital pages of social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, in the form of harassing posts. I've experienced this personally. It's a shift from how political journalism used to be. I've covered many wars and feel that the perils in covering politics in the US today are beginning to show dangerous similarities with coverage of conflict." I'm going to leave us with that as a final thought. Here's a screen that gives you the real overview of what my book tackles. And I think what I want to say by concluding thoughts and save us some time for Q&A is that I think that photography is as dominant a mode of communication as the written word. And yet I also think that the public is less trained in how to be critical thinkers of photography and critical readers of photography. I think that photography, of course, can enlighten all of us in the public so that suffering and death and disease and injustice and atrocity are not rendered unseen and unknown. And I believe, and this is why I did this talk tonight, that a deeper understanding of the hows and whys of journalism is crucial for public engagement and crucial for understanding why we need to respect journalism, and crucial also for demanding good journalism and better journalism and even better journalism. So I think I'm going to end it on that, and we can move to Q&A.
Thank you, Lauren. Before you take that, oh, I missed you.
Oh, sorry.
I wanted to ask you about the photo on the cover of your book, and have you offer just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a photograph by Spencer Platt. He is a staff photographer with Getty Images, and this was taken about a year and a half ago in Gaza when there was a lot of fighting. It was very dangerous for journalists. A few journalists were injured and a few journalists were killed as well.
Okay. So there are a couple questions here about the way that you speak to students. You know, you said earlier that you urge them to slow down and think, which has got to be an extremely difficult task in this dizzying time, this dizzying media world. One of the questions here from Mary Charlotte Dumandi, hi Mary Charlotte, is how did you respond to that insensitive student who asked, why should I care? And then a follow-up question from Sydney Pope, which is great too. How would you respond to that comment today, given all that you've learned and put together with this book?
Great questions. So as I said, I was really caught off guard in the moment. Because I had never had a student say something like that. So I did what professors do when they don't have an answer, and I tossed it back to the class. And I said, how do the rest of you respond to his comment? And what do the rest of you make of this photo? And we did wind up having a very productive conversation that day and thought through his response. The question of how would I respond to that today? The process of doing the book, in fact, made me much more sensitive to the students' reaction. And I think his words were very ill chosen. They're also the words of a 20 or 21-year-old. I think he could have framed it better, but I think it's a lot to ask anyone to take in these kinds of images all the time. And that's not what I was asking of him in my class, but I think we've all had moments where you look at an extremely upsetting image and it's just not the right moment for you to look at it. You just can't take it in. Something else is, you're already having a bad day and it's just one image too much. And so how I would react to him today, I would have a little bit more of an understanding of his starting point. And I would still use that to have the same conversation we had in class and to try to prod my students to think about why is that the reaction and when is the better time to look at the image, and how can we, even when things are very distressing and upsetting and make us feel really bad, how can we take better steps forward in the world because we now have this knowledge.
So we were fortunate enough to have Ron Haviv come out and speak for us last year. And I know you're busy working with him on a project. And I want to ask you a couple of things about that. And one is a question about ethics. And photojournalists, especially those in conflict zones, can rub up against this ethical point of, at what point do I intervene, or at what responsibility do I bear given that I'm in this situation? Can you speak a little bit to that issue?
Yeah, and it's a question that I've even put to Ron Haviv. So I know that what he has said, and other photographers have said this too, although it's not the answer that everyone gives. But Ron's answer is, I'm a human first, I am a photographer second. So if there is some way in which I can intervene to save a life or to change what is unfolding, I will do that. If there is someone on scene better qualified to do it, if we're talking about somebody who's been shot and there's a medic nearby, the medic should be doing that. Of course, there are instances, and Ron has experienced them, other photojournalists as well, where if you try to intervene, the, let's say, warring parties will turn their guns on the photographers. And so your form of intervention becomes the creation of visual evidence that can then hold perpetrators accountable for their actions.
Well, let's pick up on this accountability issue. We've explored digital forensics in a couple of different ways in the conference so far, of finding footage, finding data that really illustrates what actually happened. And a question here from Brian Goldbeck, and I think this reflects on Ron's work in Panama and Bosnia as well. Brian writes, in Ethiopia in May 2005, following electoral violence, a brave photographer took pictures at the hospital and posted them online, as dozens of those killed by government sharpshooters were shot in the mouth or head from less than 100 yards. Doing this undercut the government's claims of self-defense. And these pictures are obviously essential to eventual accountability. So Lauren, in your opinion, what role have such photos, such difficult yet damning photos, played in the past, in your opinion?
I think the person who made that comment is absolutely right, that particularly in spaces, those in power, the powers that be, will often try to spin narratives or give us some falsified history. And there's a saying that journalism is the first rough draft of history. And here's an example where we have the first rough draft that is countering these lies being put out by the Ethiopian government and showing us the evidence needed to correct that understanding. And I mean, a specific example, and again, it's, let's say, to go back to the Ron Haviv example, as you said, we're working on a project together. We have a film in progress called Biography of a Photo. And one of the photos that we're exploring was taken at the very beginning of the Bosnian War. And it's a photograph that documents ethnic cleansing. And the photograph, Ron himself has said at the time, the photo didn't incite the actions that he wanted it to, right? You take a picture of ethnic cleansing, you expect the public, the powers that be, the world, to react and to do something to stop this kind of horrific murder. And that didn't happen when the photograph was taken and first published. But the photo, and I think this is true of photography as a medium, takes on other lives over time. So that photograph is one of the inspirations for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. That photograph has been used to indict and convict warlords and some of the political leaders of that war. So I think you absolutely can demand that the photography act as evidence to correct narratives. I think in the case of Ethiopia, in many other cases, you have to remember also these journalists are taking on enormous risks, right? To put that imagery out there puts them very much in danger with governments that don't want it out there. And if I spoke about the risks in the United States, and it's an increasing risk, but we still are not, in the United States, journalists aren't being shot for putting their work out. And yet this is a real issue around the world where journalists are silenced, they're arrested, they're imprisoned, they're killed for their work, for doing the kind of work that questioner just described.
And can you tell us a little bit about the documentary with Ron and what it covers and when we might have a look at it?
Yes, so the documentary, again, it's called Biography of a Photo, and it focuses on two photographs. The one I described from Bosnia, which was taken in 1992, and a photograph that was taken in Panama in 1989. Both photos are considered among the most iconic in the part of the world where they were taken. And iconic images lead very, very long lives. So if, for instance, the photo in Panama, it shows an elected official covered in blood because the dictator at the time didn't think this official would win the election and wanted him kind of taken down. And it was published very widely. It's quite dramatic to see an elected official drenched in blood. And it was published as a piece of journalism. But when a photo becomes iconic, it doesn't just have the kind of 24-hour or 1 week cycle of a journalistic image. It carries forward over time, and it starts to become part of the collective memory. It starts to play a role in shaping how education is taught. It plays a role in art. It has a role in truth and reconciliation commissions, depending on which photo you're talking about. So the film is a look at how these two photos have biographies that have stretched about 30 years in time, and the way they have changed in meaning over time. And at a very kind of personal level, there are people who are connected to the violent histories depicted in the images, and both of those people are survivors, and both have used these two iconic images to try to obtain justice in the wake of kind of larger historical forces that want to silence them. So the film is not finished yet. We hope to have it done within a year, and everyone can check, of course, biographyofaphoto.com to watch our trailer.
I'll paste that into the chat, and we'll certainly take a look at it. And of course, your book. I have one final question for you, because it was something that you mentioned in terms of, do American media outlets or institutions have a different approach to photojournalism and a different approach to using photographs to tell a story than perhaps a European country might?
Yes, in some regards. I mean, if we're talking about, let's say, graphic, violent images, there are parts of the world where publishing very graphic photos is more common. In the United States, it is not super common to publish extremely graphic images. But this isn't just a question of graphic versus non-graphic. There are also racialized implications of this. It is more likely in US media that we will see images, if we're going to see images of dead bodies or broken bodies, it's more likely, and studies have shown this, that there'll be Black or brown bodies, often from far away, sometimes here at home. So yeah, there are differences in how images are used. There are differences that play out along these various lines. It's definitely, there's a growing awareness and critique of these disparities coming from inside and outside the industry.
Well, Lauren, thank you so much. That was fascinating. I would love to hear you speak for another few hours about your many photographs, but I guess we just have to go and buy your book and see your documentary.
There we go.
Good. Well, thank you so much for joining us. The book again is Conflict Photography. We'll have the link on our website and the chat, and we'll put the documentary film into the chat too. Thank you so much for taking the time. We really, really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, Sandy.
Thank you, and best of luck to you.
Thanks.
So we're about to bring Laura Pascas back out to the stage, and I, just before doing so, as we like to do in all our journalism conferences and our gala and elsewhere, and even just a normal talk, feature some of our amazing high school fellows. And tonight we're going to feature Margot. She's at the Ask Academy in Rio Rancho. And a special hello to her teacher, Krista Pink. I hope you are all doing well. Hopefully we get to see you again in person sometime soon. So here is Margot, and then we'll return with Laura.
COVID-19 may have altered my life, but it has also opened up a virtual world. I know a lot of us are tired of hearing about everything we've lost to the pandemic. So today I wanted to talk not about what I've lost, but rather about what I've gained. It would have been incredibly easy to just sit in my room and mope about not getting a senior prom, or participating in my final Model United Nations conference. But I've discovered that a lot of the adaptations I've had to make will serve me even after COVID disappears. They aren't COVID adaptations, but rather life adaptations. For example, virtual platforms have given me a way to communicate with people outside of my circle. I haven't been able to physically travel, but I've found communities of people from all across the world who share my passions and values. A few months ago, I came across a social media page for an organization called Women in Model United Nations. It was founded by 2 high school seniors to help female Model UN delegates overcome the challenges we face participating in an activity traditionally dominated by men. I hadn't always noticed those challenges, but other women's stories really resonated with me, and quickly I realized how much we shared. Maybe it was the lockdown talking, but a few weeks later, I applied for a position on its executive board. Soon, I found myself with a position organizing workshops and writing articles. It's been incredibly rewarding to have this opportunity to collaborate with other women from around the world. COVID-19 has definitely altered my world, especially limiting local interactions, but paradoxically, it has also opened up a much broader virtual world. Even as shutdowns have narrowed my life, I've found ways to broaden my horizons beyond what I would have had in a normal year. I have a community now of people from all over the world with incredibly diverse experiences and perspectives. I'm stuck in the house, but now I have an entire world to explore. and the virtual world has no borders. Thank you.
And thank you, Margot. Thank you very much. I'm going to now welcome into the conversation Laura Pascas. Welcome back, Laura.
Hi, Sandy. Thanks. I loved learning from Lauren just now, and Margot was awesome. It's really
So
nice
good.
to see.
So we have discussed many a crisis tonight, and I know that you are now going to sort of walk us through perhaps the biggest crisis of them all. So welcome.
Thank you.
Let me turn it over to you now, and away we go.
Okay, my dog decided to drink from his water bowl right now, and I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, so I've been a journalist for almost 20 years now, writing about things like water, energy, wildlife, and climate change. I became an environmental reporter for a couple of reasons. My first career after college was as an archaeologist and then a tribal consultant. And I really loved fieldwork. Coming to the Western United States from the East Coast where I grew up was a really amazing experience for me. I loved fieldwork and being immersed within landscapes for weeks or months at a time. And there were some reasons I did not love archaeology, which became clear to me while doing that. So I became a tribal consultant, thinking that it was, my job to work with tribes and governments and help make projects like pipelines or dams or road widenings, things like that, less destructive to the environment and communities. But that's not what the job actually was, and that's not what tribal consultation is in the United States, unfortunately. So I took that love of landscapes and skies and dirt and coyotes, and I took some of the anger and the outrage, and I decided to become a journalist instead. I started my career at High Country News, and I worked in print, online radio, and now I work in public television. And through environmental journalism, I could keep learning about the world around me and write stories that would help shine a light on problems or help people understand more about science or politics or decision making or corruption or whatever it might be. And I hope that by having more information, people can make good decisions for themselves and for their communities. So, but in some ways, if I'm totally honest, the last 18 years have also represented something of a descent into seeing landscapes that aren't just scarred but are forever changed. This is an aerial view of Chaco Canyon. You can see the visitor center here and the road to some of the sites. And here you can see how close oil and gas drilling and its impacts have come to living communities and sacred sites. So I've also, seen the impacts of oil and gas on landscapes firsthand and watched fish die and birds disappear when a river dries. This is one of my colleagues, Kevin Maestas, this summer when we were documenting the drying of the Rio Grande. And what happens when a river dries is fish find refuge in whatever sort of spots they can until those spots dry as well. I think over the course of my career, I've often been discouraged seeing how little humans actually seem to care for so many species, big or small, that we're willing to let species go extinct, to literally just kind of push them off the face of the planet that we share. I've spent a lot of time covering the science. Here's a little silvery minnow being raised in a hatchery since they can't regularly survive in the river anymore. And looking into history and talking with people about their landscapes and their rivers and their homes and the work that they do, the problems they face, how they see the world changing around them. And so for many years, I wrote about just the science, just the facts, the observations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. First of all, here in New Mexico, as temperatures keep rising at a rate nearly twice the global average. This chart just goes to about 2015. We've continued getting warmer and warmer. And so what are some of the impacts of warming on the Southwest? Well, the middle Rio Grande dries regularly in the summer. This is the middle Rio Grande looking upstream from San Antonio, New Mexico. And this is kind of remarkable because this past winter we had close to normal snowpack from November to February, but the river still dried. And there are a lot of reasons for that. We have warmer springs, windy springs, thirsty forests and soils. We use the river's water to irrigate fields and supply cities. And here in New Mexico, like most states, but here in New Mexico for sure, rivers don't have rights to their own waters. So there might be endangered species protections in a particular area or something like that, but it's acceptable and it's legal to dry up long stretches of the Rio Grande and the Pecos River and even the Gila River down in southwestern New Mexico. So when this happens, when rivers like the Rio Grande dry, everyone still gets their water. All the humans, we still get our water. Though that won't necessarily be the case in 2021, which frankly is going to be a really interesting year for water and climate reporters and a terrible year for farmers and ecosystems in New Mexico. But it is a pretty devastating thing to watch the state's largest river dry and to see that year after year and to know that we'll have more years like this one where precipitation is close to normal, but it's so warm that it's still not enough water. And it's devastating to know that we'll have more years where there won't be precipitation and conditions will be even worse. For example, we're in a La Nina winter, or there's a forecast for a La Nina winter, which means less precipitation than normal. And we're also still seeing those temperatures go up and up. So right now, our streams and our rivers are very low, and so are our reservoirs. We've also pumped so much of our groundwater, particularly since the 1950s, that many parts of the state see drastically dropping groundwater levels, and we don't even have reserves underground to rely on for these bad years in the future. So it's not just reporting on the environment, reporting on water in the southwestern United States is no longer about just 1 or 2 or 3 bad years. These bad years are no longer an exception. So this is again from sort of first days of June. And at this point, there were about 20 miles dry. And I'm hoping that this video will work so you can see this. This is some drone footage from my colleague Kevin Maestas again. I'm just going to play this for you so you can see what that river looks like when it dries. So again, that's from early June of this year. And at that point, there were only about 20 miles dry. Later in the summer, there were about 40 miles dry in 2 stretches. And you can see from that video that the fields are still being irrigated. It's just the water drawn from the river dries up. So another impact, and if you're here in New Mexico, you remember Las Conchas. You remember 2011, June 2011, when the Las Conchas fire ignited in the Jemez Mountains. Just to back up a little bit, here in the West, we've seen our fire season expand and intensify, and the size of our fires grow much bigger. And our fires have more sort of severe and intense fire behavior. So here's Las Conchas in a photograph from the International Space Station. This is in its early hours. And until this year's sort of absolutely bananas fire season, especially in Colorado, Las Conchas was kind of the poster child for extreme fire behavior. So all told, Las Conchas devoured 156,000 acres, and its flames were visible from Santa Fe. I still talk to people all the time who remember being able to see the mountains in the distance and being able to see those flames. Even from where I live in Albuquerque, about 40 miles from the fire, that Sunday morning in June, we saw the pyrocumulus cloud that shot out of the mountains. This photo is from Placitas, New Mexico, which is a little bit outside of Albuquerque. And so if you're not familiar with fires and fire behavior, this sort of pyrocumulus cloud had typically been pretty unusual. It's not the kind of thing that every fire sees. But what happens is the fire is burning so hot and so intensely that it shoots these columns into the sky of hot air and basically creates its own weather, and looks oftentimes, if you're just seeing sort of the top half of it, looks something similar to a summer monsoon storm. And they're really dangerous because they also can collapse and spread the fire wildly in different directions. So they're really dangerous, especially for firefighters. So Las Conchas, just to help you understand, if you weren't here in New Mexico, some of that extreme fire behavior, this fire grew from 40 acres to 43,000 acres in its first 14 hours, burning about an acre a second, which is just incredibly fast. It was burning incredibly hot. And it really defied the rules of fire, even here in the Southwest. And it also changed our expectations when it comes to fire and what comes back after the flames. One of the things that is typical, but is also awful to see, is after a fire like this that destroys so much vegetation, we see really awful flooding. I'm going to try to play this video for you, but I'm not totally sure. Okay, so this is from Phoebe Swina, who's from the Pueblo of Cochiti. She grabbed some footage. These floods that happened after Las Conchas, they wrecked orchards in Dixon, New Mexico, reshaped Frijoles Canyon in minutes. If you've ever been to Bandelier National Monument, upended the watershed of Santa Clara Creek and hit the Pueblo of Santa Clara. So I'll just play a little bit of Phoebe's video. So you can see how without trees and other plants holding soil in place, as soon as it rains after these big fires, there are these really devastating floods. Not to belabor the point, but it's just astonishing to see this, these floods here. So that was in 2011, but Las Conchas is still teaching us lessons. I'm gonna try to get off this page, but let's see how that goes. We have to, sorry, y'all. Okay, so sorry about that. So Less Conscious is still teaching us even more about, sorry. Let's try that again. Okay. All right. So Less Conscious is still teaching us lessons. So this is Cochiti Canyon in the burn scar of Less Conscious. And so in some places in the burn scar, the fire was so intense that it destroyed the seed source for even ponderosas, which are trees that evolved along with fire in these mountains and are actually dependent upon fire for reproduction. So what happened though, in certain areas, the fire burned so hot that it completely destroyed the seed source. But even beyond that, the climate has changed so much in these mountains that it's warmer now, so that the same trees and plants can't come back. The conditions just aren't right for them anymore. So this photo is from 6 years after Las Conchas burned. And these few photos that I'm going to show you right now are from within this 30,000 acre area within the burn scar that is just completely changed. So this was a dense conifer forest. Again, this is 7 years after the fire. And you can see in this slide where there is some vegetation remaining. I mean, there were a few trees that survived in the area, the ponderosa pines. And you can see some kinds of scrub oak and things like that starting to come back. But just try to sort of imagine what this would have looked like before the fire, a dense conifer forest. And this is a really important slide for people to understand sort of how fires like Las Conchas affect everything downstream. So this is on the eastern edge of the Jemez Mountains, and this is the middle Rio Grande Valley. And right here is Cochiti Reservoir, which is the place where all of that sediment, all of that ash ends up. And so when we have these big fires like Las Conchas, there are the immediate impacts, right? The expense, the dangers, the loss of wildlife, you know, the fear that it causes. And then we have the floods, and then we have these transitional forests where forests are just changed entirely, entire ecosystems shift and change. And then we have all these downstream impacts on the watershed. So I went out here in 2017 a number of times with Colin Haffey, who he's an ecologist who at that time worked for the USGS. And he gave me a tour kind of around this area that had been a dense conifer forest before Las Conchas. And on the day before Easter 2017, we visited the Heart of Darkness. And that's the name that Haffey and some of his colleagues gave this 33,000 acre area. And Colin talked to me about those initial days of the fire, which broke out at the end of June. It was still burning at midnight, long after normal fire weather, he told me. Las Conchas broke all the rules. There were huge plumes blowing up, and then there'd be nothing to burn, and the columns would collapse. It was like fluid dynamics more than fire, he said. He told me how burning gases shot fireballs hundreds of feet into the air. And he also described seeing needles still on the trees after the fire. They were flash frozen, kind of a grayish color. He explained that when the fire roared through the trees, it burned the windward side and created a back eddy on the leeward side, baking the needles rather than burning them. Las Conchas was devastating and it was expensive, and it was the biggest fire in New Mexico's recorded history until the next year when the Whitewater Baldy fire in the Gila burned almost 300,000 acres, almost twice what Las Conchas burned in the Jemez. So lots of places this past year experienced really devastating fires. In particular, we all watched on the news what was happening in California and Colorado. Here in New Mexico, we were really lucky. And I say that recognizing that not everybody was lucky. People do lose property. Firefighters certainly are put at risk, and this year put at even greater risk because of COVID. But as fire years go, New Mexico was really lucky this year, but we had a really unusual fire season with fires igniting late in the summer and then into the fall, which is outside of our normal fire season. So I've talked to you a little bit about dry rivers and big fires in disappeared forests. There are some other, these are some of, the biggest, most obvious signs of climate change that we can see here in New Mexico. But there's all sorts of other impacts, and I just want to run through those briefly. So these are some that are listed in the 4th National Climate Assessment, which was released in November 2018. So one of the big things for the Southwest is that higher temperatures amplify droughts and contribute to hot drought, which is when precipitation either doesn't fall or it falls as rain instead of snow. And this continued warming will contribute to aridification, which is, in this report, they say potentially permanent transition, but I think that we can assume that it's a pretty permanent transition to an even drier environment than we already have today. So we know that human-caused climate change is contributing to water scarcity, and this is exacerbated by things like drought, demands from growing population, deteriorating and really outdated infrastructure, and our dropping groundwater supplies. So all of these things together put more and more stress on our already strapped water supplies. So we also know that forests and other ecosystems are having a harder time providing wildlife habitat, clean water, and even jobs due to drought, wildfire, and climate change. And these numbers are a little bit out of date again, but the burned footprint in the Western United States is much higher than what it would have been without rising temperatures. So as long as we continue emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, the Southwest will continue to experience even bigger wildfires, which, like we just walked through, also contributes to flooding and erosion and all sorts of downstream problems. We're also seeing shifts in where certain plants and wildlife species can live. This is particularly something that people are paying attention to in the mountains, where species get pushed higher and higher as temperatures get higher, and they're trying to move higher and higher to find that zone within which they can live, and eventually they come to the top of the mountain, the top of their habitat, and places where they can no longer survive. One of the really important things that we need to acknowledge is that Southwestern tribes face increased risks from drought and wildfire, and along the California coast, things like changing ocean conditions. And this is a really, really important thing that we need to be talking about, because there's all sorts of historical factors that contribute to this, including that the United States government restricted some tribal nations to the driest portions of their traditional homelands. So they're at increased risk for water scarcity, the loss of traditional foods, and changes in the ranges of plants and animals that they rely on. So there's all sorts of ways in which our historical actions and our contribution of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere are making life harder and will make life harder for tribal communities into the future. And this is something that we really need to be talking about, especially in the Southwestern United States. So climate change also affects energy demand and supply. As temperatures rise, especially in the Southwest and along the border region, we'll see demands for more electricity, for more power to be supplying things like air conditioning and swamp coolers. But all of those plants also demand more water. And so we're in this situation where we're wanting more and we're using more, but there's less and less. And of course, we all know that hydraulic fracturing and other sorts of oil and gas development uses a lot of water, pollutes a lot of water, and contributes to further climate change. And we also need to think about future food insecurity. This coming year in New Mexico in particular is going to be a really challenging year for farmers. COVID aside, we're already seeing irrigation districts, particularly in southern New Mexico, talking about how we don't have water in storage. And so with a La Nina winter, we won't be seeing much snowpack and runoff. And so farmers in the Elephant Butte Irrigation District are being warned to not expect any allocation of water in the 2021 irrigation season. We also know that climate change has public health impacts. People who have respiratory disorders, allergies, we see things like plague and hantavirus spreading, even certain fungi that live in the soils and are typically restricted in their habitat, where you see people like in Tucson or very southern New Mexico getting sick with what's called valley fever, but we are seeing those spores moving north as soils dry out. So that's, there's also these big public health impacts. So, okay, so that's like a lot, right? If you're still watching, if you haven't turned off and poured yourself like a giant drink, thank you. That's a lot that's happening, right? And there's a lot of information. And so for years and years, I have written about the science and these on the ground changes. And I've also been asking people how they feel about the things that are happening. I talked to lots of people about how they feel about the changes that they're seeing in their landscapes, in their homes, in their farms. But I've also been asking the past few years how scientists feel about these things. Because I was feeling like pretty rotten about what I was seeing all around me. I became an environment reporter because I love being outside and I love forests and deserts, and I find solace in these places. And I love my home and I love my community in New Mexico. And I think a lot about what Barry Lopez has said about love and writing. And I think of my reporting as an articulation of love for the land and for my communities. But like years and years of this type of reporting, I was really having a hard time not seeing the changes that I was learning about all the time. Like even in places where the big impacts of climate change aren't noticeable yet, where there's not, a 33,000 acre burn scar with nothing growing back. I'd be out hiking with my family or whatever, and I would see where junipers were dying off, or little sprouts coming up too early in the spring, or like this year at the end of November in my backyard. And I started having a harder and harder time seeing the beauty and seeing all those things that I loved. When I would go hiking, I couldn't see the forest anymore because I could just see, oh, those conifers are dying off and weakening, and look, they're losing all their needles, or their needles are turning yellow. And seeing these trees dying off because of drought or insect infestations. And in some places they are being replaced like other species like oaks and aspens, but for like a number of reasons, but in large part because of the work that I was doing, I really started kind of slipping. And I would imagine lots of people feel that way, but I kept doing the work and talked to people like fisheries biologists about endangered species, and we would talk about population numbers and recovery strategies. But we'd also talk about what it was like to be like some of the only people in the whole world paying attention to a tiny little fish species that was becoming increasingly rare, and what it was like to be, one of the only people who cared that this Rio Grande silvery minnow, which had once been one of the most populous fish in the Rio Grande, what it was like to be among the only people who cared that it was about to go extinct. And I talked to ecologists about what it was like to see these forests that they had spent their lifetimes, their careers studying, suddenly just ignite and be gone and be changed forever. Sort of, watching these changes and listening to sources, and it was pretty discouraging to also see how politicians and lawmakers and people in positions of power and influence weren't doing anything about climate change. Or worse, they were, kind of actively pushing back against any sort of progress we were making. Here in New Mexico, we had a governor for 8 years who, sort of directed all executive agencies to not do anything on climate change, to do barely anything on water planning, really pushing the state of New Mexico at a critical time backwards in terms of anything, anything from cutting emissions and, kind of reining in the oil and gas industry to even talking about how people and industries and farmers and communities were going to be adapting to changes. And I think it's important. I know that especially today, people are very excited to know that the incoming presidential administration will take climate change seriously and start moving forward. But I want to point out that despite a lot of rhetoric from the United States has never been a leader on climate change. The United States never ratified Kyoto even, and even under the Obama administration, I was covering the United Nations climate talks in 2010 and was shocked to go to those meetings in Cancun and see the disconnect between people like Pacific Islanders who are literally begging for help as they see their islands going underwater, literally begging for help, sort of like grabbing me in the hallways and asking, why don't Americans care about climate change? If you would just tell our stories, we're sure that Americans would understand and would ask their government to do something about it. So the disconnect between what is happening out in the world and the role that the United States has played in those climate negotiations, where we've refused to cut emissions, we've refused to fully fund programs that help people in these nations that are experiencing really severe impacts. So I think, yes, let's have some cautious optimism that the United States will at least join the world stage on climate change, but we can't pretend that we are exceptional or that we have done very much on climate change. So just to mention that. And of course, Donald Trump has been troubling, to say the least, in terms of climate change and anything environmental related. But so anyway, sorry, that was a tangent. But so 8 years of a Republican governor who was pushing us backwards. And then 2016, the election of Donald Trump. At that time, the science on climate change was so crystal clear. Scientists are not only telling us why the climate was changing, their forecasts for all different kinds of climate models were really showing how temperatures were going to be rising and what kinds of impacts those were going to be having all around the world. And scientists were really clear in telling us kind of what was going to happen and how we can actually address climate change. And people ask a lot of times, what do we need to do to stop climate change? What we need to do is stop emitting greenhouse gases. And scientists have been saying that for decades, since the 1960s at least. So we know how to address climate change. We just have chosen not to do that. And we're seeing these impacts all over the world. We're seeing them in New Mexico. We're seeing them in the Pacific Islands. We're seeing them in our melting glaciers around the world. And yet we continue to not act. And I just gotta tell you that working on this type of reporting, I really started to kind of let my own heart go dark. I still covered the news, especially at the beginning of the Trump administration and through the Trump administration now, but it got harder and harder. And kind of my heart got harder as well. And I also started to worry that by covering all the bad news all the time, by showing you all dry riverbeds all the time and decimated forests, as an environment reporter, I was just hardening other people's hearts as well, or causing you despair and grief, or causing you to stop paying attention or to feel overwhelmed. And so a couple of years ago, it's been a few years now, my dad died. And he and I had this super complicated relationship, but it was the first time since I was a kid that I went to the funeral of somebody who was really close to me. And it was awful, like for real. You all know how awful something like that is. But that ceremony and the ceremonies around his death and dying and grieving really reminded me, especially in the years afterwards, that if it's okay to mourn one person, to cry and throw yourself down on the ground and rethink, your place in the world because one person died, that it is entirely okay to mourn an ecosystem or a species or even your ideas about the world around you. So I want to give you all some permission at the same time that I throw these like terrible things at you. I want to give you permission, in case you needed it, to mourn and to feel sad. And you can throw yourself down on the ground and you can cry or shake your fist at the stars. But something that I've had to come to terms with over the past few years is that this world with dry rivers or different forests is still worth loving and still worth investing in and still worth hiking through and having a relationship with. And for me as a reporter, that doesn't mean like that I stop asking questions or covering hard issues. It still means showing up and pointing out the problems and asking questions and telling these stories, but telling these stories with even more love for the places and the people whose stories they are, because we don't get to love the world less just because we've changed it so much. I think that actually means that we need to love it more. And I'm no longer like trying to close off my heart or to shore myself up against the defeats and the despair. Because even looking at the Rio Grande, which has been consistently low, and this year through the summer and fall was just historically low and really sad to see. We have to keep loving the world around us, and we have to keep our sense of wonder for the world around us, and we have to keep ourselves from slipping into that heart of darkness. And I hope that you will do that too, and I really appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. We have a couple questions, and I want to build on a question asked here by Mary Costello, which I think comes back to the kind of core of this conference, which is well, what role does the media have to play from where you sit in terms of our climate change awareness and in terms of even just combating climate change? How can the media, how can journalists specifically take a stand in this, or provide us with what we need to know in order to act differently or better?
That's such a great question. And I kind of have two practical answers, I think. One is that climate change needs to be covered on a local or regional level. It's great when we see those like great New York Times or Washington Post stories. The national media comes out with these amazing climate change stories on, a variety of related topics. But until people see climate change reporting in their local media, I think it still kind of stays a little bit abstract. I can read that great story in the New York Times about melting glaciers, say in the Himalayas, but until I really understand what's happening in my own state or my own area, I might not really understand quite what's happening and how serious it is. So I think, which is which is really tricky because local newspapers and local media has just been devastated in the past decade, but especially recently, there just aren't very many local newspapers and their staff are really small. They certainly don't need something else to be covering. But I don't understand why, say, the local meteorologist on your commercial TV station is not talking about climate change. They should not be, sort of, oh, it's another hot one out there in October or the summer's heat wave. That should be put in context. It is a public service to put all of that into context. So that's one answer. The other thing is that climate change reporting shouldn't just be limited to what everybody considers the environment be. It's a business story. It's it's a local government story. Climate change crosses all of the different kinds of categories within your local newspaper. And I think that people can, when something runs in a newspaper or on commercial TV or even public television, lots of people react to things. Certainly big businesses and the Chamber of Commerce react to news stories, and readers should do and question, well, why doesn't this story about a heat wave have context about climate change? I think letters to the editor and phone calls are still a really valuable way that people can weigh in on their local news coverage.
Mm-hmm. I love how it's just incidentally started to rain here in Taos pretty strongly as we're talking about all this. But let me let me ask you about coronavirus. I know that we don't really know what the impact of our reduced consumption, our reduced emissions during this period may have on climate change, but do you have any thoughts connecting coronavirus to the current situation in climate change or in New Mexico at the very least?
Yeah, I think one of the things, so we've known for a long time in New Mexico that we need to diversify our economy. Even if you don't care about climate change, New Mexico needs to diversify its economy away from such strong dependence on oil and gas. And I think and that's a really hard conversation to have, and that's an even harder thing to put into action. But I think what coronavirus did, what it showed us, especially in those early days, right, in March and April when prices dropped so low, it showed us that we need to do that. We need to diversify the economy and cut that extreme dependence on oil and gas sooner rather than later. Because all of the global forecasts for oil and gas show that, yes, there are booms and busts, but there's not widespread expectation for the industry to ever entirely recover for lots of different reasons, not just because of coronavirus. And so I think the pandemic has actually offered New Mexico like an early way out to think about all of these issues. And in terms of the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions due to less activity or things like that, I think there's some data that shows there have been these dips, but the problem is when we come back out, it can go back up again. And so I think we just need to be really serious as a country and committing to just cutting emissions. That's the only thing that's going to help with climate change.
And of course, we're talking about photography here. We're talking about the power of images. There's a question here from Shelley Winship. Can the reality of climate change be adequately communicated to the general populace? Is there a technology in the works that might help us better express? I've heard often the challenge with climate change is the numbers are either so big or are so small they're hard to grab onto. How do we better communicate what's going on with our environment?
Yeah, I think that part of it is just repeating stuff over and over and over again. I'm sure that people in New Mexico are so sick of me covering the dry Rio Grande every year, but I feel like you just have to cover those things year after year, time after time, until people really really get that it's not just a one shot deal. It's like we need consistent, clear coverage of climate change and its impacts. And whether that's through photography or news stories or essays or television, I think the main thing for me is just the consistency over and over again.
I agree. And also educating our kids. And, I see a very different consciousness around the environment and protecting the environment, and a wholehearted acceptance of climate science in the younger generation. How do we keep that momentum rolling? How do we better educate not only ourselves, but the next generation in terms of having the tools and perspective needed to be on top of this?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think making sure that educators themselves understand climate change is really important, and getting lessons about climate change from the very earliest grades, and whether that's things like um, focusing on wildlife or your garden or growing seasons, or it's experiments that show like how the greenhouse gas effect works. Um, Hands-on science always resonates with kids. And I'm constantly and pleasantly surprised by how clearly young people seem to understand the seriousness of climate change. And part of it is likely they have grown up in an entirely different world from the world I grew up in. They grew up with school shootings. They grew up with uncertain economic futures. They grew up with the loom of climate change always hanging over them. And they understand climate change. They understand the urgency. And one of the things that I loved when I was finishing up my book, kind of the last chapter ended up being about youth activists. And I love the urgency and the ferocity that they bring to the movement. They are not waiting. They might not be able to vote, but they are going to put so much pressure on anyone in a position of decision making. And I think that the youth activists understand the issues far better than most adults do.
Let's talk about economics for a minute, because I know that's where climate change science kind of can sometimes hit a wall. And of course, the inaction that this country has exhibited on climate change can be attributed to a few things, but probably comes back to economics in some ways. So a question here from Margot Peterson: considering the economic cost of inaction on climate change, as well as the increased cost, of course, for native areas, what would you say to someone who says that action on climate change is simply too expensive?
Boy, I'd say you're nuts.
Yeah, wake up.
Yeah, I mean, we see just even how expensive, how devastating it is when these hurricanes keep hitting the Gulf Coast. And if we had thought more carefully decades ago about protecting those coastlines with mangrove forests instead of fragile oil and gas infrastructure, how different life would be for so many people. It's like, just even thinking about regular maintenance on your house. Yeah, it kind of stinks when you have to fix the cracks in your roof and maybe you don't have the money that month to do it. But when the next time it rains, you're pretty miserable. So I understand that it's hard to commit, but the fact that we have not spent millions on climate change adaptation and things like that over the past few decades just means we're going to be spending billions and billions in the coming years.
We pay now or we pay later, and we'll probably pay a whole lot more later. But it just also seems like written into the fabric here in many ways is there needs to be a cataclysm to stop the system from functioning the way it is in order to accept that it needs to adapt and build and grow into a very different way. And I certainly hope that we'll get to that. The great question here from Diana Cervantes. She says, Laura, can you talk a little bit about the importance of fostering a sense of place in the environment? I know you talk a bit about this in your book, but I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, I think, you know, I love living in New Mexico because I feel like, because it's great, right? And I feel like people in New Mexico totally are connected with their landscapes, with the seasons. You know, we pay attention to everything here. And maybe people in other places do too, and I'm not giving people enough credit for that. But New Mexicans are very connected to their places. And I think, you know, whether that's because you work the land or you recreate or, you know, kind of whatever the millions of reasons that people connect with landscapes. I think for me, one of the things is connecting with landscape and joy. And, you know, even when the river is low, go jump in it, go play, let your kids play in the river, go play outside, explore your neighborhood. And I think there has been so much emphasis, especially in the last few decades, on if you want to enjoy nature or the environment, you have to travel to go do it. You need to go to some wilderness area, or you need to go on a vacation somewhere. And I think New Mexicans know, like, nature is us. Nature is all around us. We are a part of nature. We are a part of the environment. And I just think that I can lecture someone about climate change forever, but if you go outside and you play outside and you feel joy outside, that you build those connections and learn more and more about the world around you and see the changes and feel emotionally invested in those changes, and then trying to figure out how to make better change instead.
Right. And the more invested we are because of the joy we experience outside, the more we want to make sure that that joy not only continues for us, but continues for our children and our grandchildren and so on. And this raises a question that I've asked a climate scientologist from, a climatologist, not a climate scientologist, a climatologist from UNM. And I asked him, and I want to ask this to you as well, are we in the place whereby where we live now may be untenable in 20, 30, 40, 70 years? Do you believe that the modeling, the data, the recent experience shows us that where we live is going to be increasingly untenable?
Yeah, I think we need to make a lot of changes in New Mexico. And I know that, you know, one of the things that is really hard to talk about is changing our farming methods. You know, here in the Middle Rio Grande, alfalfa still is a really big water user, a really prominent crop that people grow, and it uses a lot of water. And I don't want to say that you have to make lots of money off of the crop that you grow in order for your growing system, for your farm to have real value. I don't think that's the case at all. But I think in New Mexico, if we look at 85% of our water being used for agriculture, and agriculture being a really small part of our economy, we need to figure out how to better connect those things, or make sure that if we do have farms that are using 85% of the state's water, we can't be a state that has food insecurity. You know, we can't be using that water for crops that don't feed people here in New Mexico. And so I know that those conversations are hard, and sometimes we make bad decisions. Like, for instance, down in southern New Mexico, there was a program years ago that helped farmers transition away from crops like alfalfa to more high value crops like pecans. And what happened was farmers started growing pecans, which is an even more dangerous crop to grow in this climate, because With alfalfa, you don't have a good water year or 2 or 3 good water years, you can fallow your fields. But with pecans or something like that, your orchards die. So one of the things that New Mexico needs to take really seriously is water planning and figure out, because it's not, we don't have a sustainable water future in the state.
Well, on that sober and somber note, Laura's recent book, of course, is At the Precipice, New Mexico's Changing Climate. Couldn't be a more timely topic to be writing about. And Laura, thank you so much for joining us here tonight. We greatly, greatly, greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Sandy.
Best of luck to you, and we will see the rest of you tomorrow when we go back into coronavirus and how it shaped African journalism. So thanks again to Laura Paskus. Thanks to Lauren Walsh. Thanks to all of you, and we'll see you soon. Bye, Lauren. Bye, everybody.